Welcome everyone to part one of the APRU Global Perspectives on Anti-Asian Racism, Overcoming the Hate webinar series. My name is Cindy Fan, Vice Provost for International Studies and Global Engagement and Professor of Geography and Asian American Studies at UCLA. It's wonderful to have this great turnout for this event. Almost 300 RSVPs were received from 25 APRU member universities and 14 non-APRU institutions. First, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping items. The webinar will be recorded and shared via email and on the website apru.org. And after presentations by our four speakers today, we'll have a short Q&A session. I'd encourage participants to use the Q&A function to ask questions. I would now like to provide a bit of background to this series. Race-based hate, including anti-Asian racism, is neither new nor geographically confined. Over the recent years, however, geopolitical tensions and the rhetoric blaming China for the COVID-19 pandemic have unleashed a wave of anti-Asian hate incidents and violence in the United States. Between March 2020 and June 2021, over 9,000 incidents were reported to the Stop AAPI Hate website. And elsewhere in the world in recent years, race-based hate has also led to violence, such as the 2019 shootings in Christchurch, targeting Muslims, many of whom were South Asians. By bridging students, experts, academic and community leaders, APRU, or Association of Pacific Rim Universities, are creating a space to share knowledge and to address these difficult experiences across the Asia-Pacific region. This dialogue is designed to open doors for greater understanding of race-based hate, how it influences our daily lives, and how to overcome it. The APRU community reflects the tightness of social networks across a wide geographic region, and we offer these discussions as a space to work together to build a more inclusive future. And APRU is committed to enhancing social well-being by combating inequality and racism, promoting diversity and inclusion, and empowering women and minorities. This series, consisting of two parts, is hosted by APRU with UCLA in partnership with the Chinese University of Hong Kong, the University of Auckland, and the University of British Columbia. We begin the series today with part one, Understanding and Overcoming Anti-Asian Hate. In about 3 weeks, on November 17 and 18, part two, Global Perspectives, will take place and will include a faculty panel and a student panel. I'd like to thank APRU's steering committee for initiating the conversation that gave rise to this series, and Professor Karen Umemoto and Professor Michael Berry for organizing the part one and part two webinars, and Dr. Chris Nguyen, Ms. Jackie Wong, and Ms. Anya Wong from the APRU Secretariat for their tremendous support. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Jean Block, Chancellor of UCLA, and Chair of APRU, to give opening remarks. Chancellor Block.
Thank you, Cindy, and hello, everyone. Thank you for participating in this important symposium. For hundreds of years, our world has been growing more and more interconnected, and the trend has only accelerated in the past few decades. Today, people and nations see great benefits from all kinds of academic and cultural exchanges. Our country's economies are closely tied to one another. Technology has allowed information and ideas to jump from place to place in a heartbeat. Increasingly, we recognize and face shared challenges like climate change and pandemics in a way that spans national borders. And our nations themselves have become more diverse, a home to many peoples of different backgrounds and many different origins. But despite how much we learn and grow alongside one another, our prosperous shared future faces a significant obstacle in ethnic nationalism, racial prejudice, hatred, and violence. Racism has, of course, affected many different groups across the globe, but in recent years, they've been particularly hard on Asian peoples. Anti-Asian hate is not a new phenomenon. And just last week, I attended an event memorializing the terrible Chinatown massacre of 1871, in which 19 Chinese immigrants were murdered in downtown Los Angeles. But in America and across the world, the past few years have been marked by a troubling increase in harassment and violence against Asians. Sometimes this has taken the form of harmful political rhetoric. Sometimes it's taken the form of brutal physical attacks. However and wherever it manifests, racial hatred is ugly, it is painful, and it threatens the very essence of a diverse civil society. Communities thrive when we have compassion for one another, but can be broken when we turn on our neighbors. No one should be targeted for their heritage. As institutions devoted to reason, understanding, collaboration, and the public good, universities can play a leading role in addressing such issues of prejudice and hate. We can set an example of better relations within our own campus communities, and we can help people and policymakers understand and confront anti-Asian hate and other forms of racism in society. That's why I'm so glad that the APRU, our member institutions, UCLA, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, the University of Auckland, and the University of British Columbia, and our other partners are putting together this event. I am sure that today's symposium and the November session, which examines this topic from a global perspective, will both be engaging and illuminating. I will close my remarks with the words of the late Chinese-American civil rights activist, Grace Lee Boggs, who taught us that the only way to survive is by taking care of one another. If we are to achieve the promise of a bright, shared global future, this wisdom is what we must all remember. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chancellor Block, for your remarks and for your leadership. I would now like to welcome our first speaker, Professor Karen Umemoto, Helen Morgan Chu Chair and Director, UCLA Asian American Studies Center. Professor Umemoto teaches in urban planning and Asian American studies and specializes in urban racial conflict, community development, and systems transformation. She published The Truth, Lessons from an LA Gang War with Cornell University Press, and Jacked Up and Unjust, Pacific Islander Teens Confront Violent Legacies with University of California Press. And she will present a conceptual framework to understand the rise in anti-Asian racism. Professor Umemoto.
Thank you very much, Cindy, Dr. Fan, and thank you very much, Chancellor Jeung, for initiating this idea of such a series. I'm going to share my screen and take you through a quick PowerPoint to walk us through like a quick bit of history and a model that I think might help all of us wherever we are deal with this growing issue. So just a little bit of background that, you know, Asian Americans in the US have been fighting racial inequality and exclusion ever since Chinese immigrants arrived over eight generations ago in the early 1800s with the California Gold Rush. They helped to build the Transcontinental Railroad, farmed large swaths of California's Central Valley, worked on fishing boats and canneries up and down the West Coast, and established some of the first communities here over 200 years ago. And since then, our population of Asians in America has grown to 22.9, almost 23 million, almost 6% of the US population, with 50 ethnic groups, over 100 languages spoken. And throughout US history, there have been periods of intense anti-Asian sentiment and violence. And ads, magazine covers, and posters like these are just some of the propaganda that reflect dominant perceptions through various points in history. And these include the continued fetishization of Asian women as well. And there have been periods of more intensified racism when the attacks have been more frequent and serious, and the impacts more far-reaching. And during the last half of the 1800s, for example, when white workers were being laid off by the railroads and gold ran dry, there was a wave of anti-Chinese attacks that extended for over 3 decades. And this was punctuated by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. A similar frenzy of intense hostility took place during World War II after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. This led to the mass incarceration of over 120,000 Japanese Americans into US concentration camps, which was one of the most egregious violations of civil liberties against a single ethno-racial group in modern American history. And this is a picture that my father gave us kids, and he's the one on the very right in front of one of the tar paper barracks. Scapegoating and attacks have continued to the present time, like with the murder of Vincent Chin, mistaken for a Japanese by auto workers who blamed Japan for their unemployment and beat him to death with a baseball bat, to Joseph Ileto, gunned down by an angry white supremacist in 1999, and attacks against Muslims following the 2017 executive order by Trump banning foreign nationals from 7 Muslim countries from entering the US. And in light of this historical backdrop, how can we understand what's happening today? And so I offer this firestorm metaphor, which I think is helpful because for any firestorm, you need fuel, heat, and oxygen. And in the case of anti-Asian hate and violence, there was plenty of fuel. You had a pandemic originating in China, and that was blamed on Chinese. Families in crisis and fear, a very jingoistic trade war with China, a weak public health and mental health system, proliferation of deadly weapons. And here Asians were caught between 2 stereotypes, this misconception of Asian Americans as the model minority, as well as the perpetual foreigner who would never be fully accepted in American society. Then you have an event that ignites the fire. And in this case, the term China virus, the calling of the COVID-19, the China virus, sparked actually kind of a cattle call by our former president that led to the scapegoating of Chinese and by association other Asians for the ills of the pandemic. And this is a really interesting graph that was done by a colleague of mine at UCLA and his colleagues, Gilbert G., that showed the increase in anti-Asian sentiment after the former president tweeted the phrase Chinese virus. And the solid line represents the number of tweets under the hashtag Chinese virus versus the dash, which for tweets under the hashtag COVID-19. And over half of the tweets under Chinese virus expressed anti-Asian sentiment. And once ignited, the fire was really carried by heavy winds. And there was so many stereotypes and attacks on social media through social networks and promulgated by extremist organizations. If you see the drawing on the right, it harkens back to drawings from the 1800s. And without any countervailing winds, such as leadership strongly and consistently condemning the attacks that have been escalating over the past year, these attacks have continued. And even though there's been strong condemnation by the current administration, fires take time to extinguish and cool. But metaphors also point to a set of solutions. And, for those of you at campuses across the country, the situations there may be in some ways similar, in many ways different. But we ask ourselves, what does it mean to clear the underbrush, lower the heat, and move the winds in a different direction? And I encourage everyone to do kind of a thought exercise using this metaphor and come up with your own ideas for how to solve this problem in the specific ways it may manifest at home. So what can we do, I think, is the question that we all ask. And I think this moment has been somewhat of an awakening for Asian Americans who have held rallies and educational events across the country. And the good news is that, similar to the Black Lives Matter movement, many people of all backgrounds have come out to show their support in very unexpected places, whether it's Eugene, Oregon, or Nashville, Tennessee, Concord, New Hampshire, and Austin, Texas. But, you know, what is it we can do in our everyday lives? And I'm just going to spend the last few minutes talking a little bit about things that we can do. I mean, I think sometimes we have friends or acquaintances that have been victimized by some of this animus. And so even just listening and giving personal support. This is Kien Nguyen. She's a 76-year-old grandmother of 6 who was harassed, and it encouraged by her son, she started organizing gatherings of others who faced similar experiences. As educators and students, probably one of the most important things we can do is to educate ourselves and others on the histories, contributions, cultural traditions, and contemporary issues of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, as well as other groups who have or are being treated unjustly and experiencing harm, discrimination, or other forms of marginalization. And for Asian Americans, since we're less than 6% of the population, there's a lot of educating to do and a lot of learning to do of others' experiences as well. A welcomed response to the problem was the show of support and solidarity by others, whether it's Portland Trailblazer Damian Lillard with his arms around his Asian American coach wearing the Stop Anti-Asian Hate t-shirt, to the signing of by 25 governors out of the 50 governors in the US condemning anti-Asian racism, violence, and hatred. And there are various community organizations doing work on this issue. So I really encourage you to reach out to them in your area. This can be anything from organizing education events and victim assistance work to community organizing, voter registration in historically marginalized communities. I do think that building alliances across organizations and movements is one of the most critical activities we can do now, and to really discuss more deeply how our issues are all linked. I think one concern that I have right now is the attacks on critical race theory is really closely connected to attacks on Black Lives Matter movement, the rise in anti-Asian hate, anti-immigrant movements, as they all stem from those who are pretty keen on defending white privilege in the US and other parts of the world. But it will take all of us working together for a more inclusive, equitable, and just society to make the world better for future generations. And I just thank all of you for being present today and for joining in these efforts.
Thank you so much, Professor Umemoto, Karen, for starting us off with the history and with the metaphor to understand why we're seeing what we're seeing today. Our next speaker is Professor Russell Jeung, Professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. Professor Russell Jeung is author of Family Sacrifices, The Worldviews and Ethics of Chinese Americans with Oxford University Press in 2019, and At Home in Exile, Finding Jesus Among My Ancestors and Refugee Neighbors with Zondervan, published in 2016. As co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate, he will present the data that has been collected to document incidents of COVID-19 discrimination and to develop long-term solutions to racism. Professor Jeung, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Fan, and thank you, APRU, for inviting us today to be, it's a real honor to be part of this distinguished panel. I'm going to present some data and stories and background that's really similar to what Professor Umemoto just presented. Her presentation was really clear and really highlights, I think, some of the key factors fomenting the current racism that we're experiencing as Asians. And I'd like to just sort of reinforce what she said. Last year, when we heard that COVID-19 was arriving from Asia, I was really concerned because I know from Asian American history that Asians are often vilified and scapegoated when diseases come. Asians then get blamed and face interpersonal violence and racist policies. And we wanted to be ready for that surge in racism. So I worked with two organizations, Chinese for Affirmative Action in San Francisco and the Asian Pacific Policy Planning Council in LA, to create a website to receive firsthand accounts of racism. And we expected, actually, originally wanted the government to do it, but when we contacted the state government, they said they didn't have the capacity. So we created our own website. And immediately we were inundated with hundreds of incidents nationwide. And I was just stunned by how hateful the stories were, how much accounts of palpable anger and fear directed towards Asians. And it still just sort of stupefies me how much racism and anger there is in the US. Later on, we developed partnerships with research institutes in Australia, New Zealand, England, and Canada, and they report similar trends. And so what I'm reporting is actually similar across the globe, similar patterns of racism, similar types of discrimination, similar reasons for the racism that I'll share with you. But to start, I'm going to share with you some of the incidents that we've received, and they're all from elders. So you don't often think of Asian elders complaining about racism, wanting to voice their concerns, going online, but we had a real high number of limited English-speaking Asians using our Asian language platform to share their stories. And so I'll just rehearse a couple with you. I was standing in an aisle at a hardware store when suddenly I was struck from behind. Video surveillance verified the incident in which a white male using his bent elbow striking my upper back. Subsequent verbal attacks occurred with "Shut up, you monkey," "F you, Chinaman," "Go back to China," bringing the China virus over here. So again, you could see the ferocity of the anger. You could see the racial taunts. You could see the nativist sentiment. And you could see the source of the anger is that people in the United States feel like Asians are the source of the disease and the ones who brought it to the US. And so the fear of the pandemic and the scapegoating of Chinese for bringing the virus is one of the main sources of the racism. Here's another. Customer began screaming at me for no reason while in line and correctly distanced at 6 feet. I am mostly Chinese and my family has been in San Luis Obispo since the 1860s. I'm fourth generation in San Luis Obispo, but guess I will never be an American. So here again is another horrific incident where a person gets screamed at, even though he had done nothing wrong. And the result is that he realizes people see him as a perpetual foreigner, like Professor Umemoto talked about, the stereotype that Asians are always outsiders to the US, never real Americans. And that's the second major part of the problem, is that we're stereotyped as outsiders, treated as foreigners. And in the US, we treat foreigners really badly. We build walls against foreigners. We separate the families of foreigners. And if you're Asian, you're perceived as a foreigner and we get mass shot at. So this foreigner status really is painful at the moment. And my last example, I was shopping and a child grabbed me and said, I should go back to my country. And I was the reason his father died. His mother came up and put her hand on my arm, but she didn't try to help me. Bakersfield occasionally has ignorant people who made fun of how I look and talk and tell me to go home. But this is the scariest and saddest experience I've had in the US since about 1977. So this is shocking because it's a kid yelling at an adult, an elder, in fact. And what this really also illustrates is that the person was traumatized. They're scared and fearful, and they're depressed and saddened. And this incident, again, isn't isolated, but it's happened across the country. And the trauma that the person experiences, the fear, the depression, is replicated across the nation. I'm arguing this is a period of collective racial trauma for Asian Americans. It's traumatic in that we show symptoms of hypervigilance, avoidance, anxiety, and depression. And it's collective in that even if we're not personally attacked, when we see another Asian attack, we know it could have been us or it could have been our elders or our family members. So what happens to one Asian happens to all of us. So here I'm sharing the 9,000 incidents we've received, and they're not all hate crimes, but they fall under 4 major categories. On the bottom, you can see that civil rights violations make up 11% of our cases. We're getting mistreated at the workplace. We're getting barred from ride shares. In the middle, you can see that online harassment makes up 8% of the cases. Young people experience online racism much more. They're on their screens a lot. Our youth report that 70% of them had seen racist comments, offensive posts in the last month. Verbal harassment makes up the bulk of our incidents. Again, we're getting yelled at with racial epithets and slurs. Again, it's similar in other nations that mostly we get yelled at. So they're not hate crimes, but they're just traumatizing verbal encounters. But assault does make up 14%, and being coughed and spat upon make up 8% of our cases. So people ask, how do you know racism has increased in the US? And I say in 2019, people weren't spitting on their fellow human, but they are at large scale in every state in the nation now. I think the coughing and spitting is peculiar to the COVID-19 in that it's a health scare. So it seems like people want to reinfect us as Asians. And physical assaults occurred so often. We're getting pushed and shoved so much. We're having bottles and rocks thrown at us so much that I wasn't surprised that elderly were killed on both coasts. I wasn't surprised, sadly, about the Atlanta or Indianapolis shootings. Again, the anger and the hate is that high. The trends have been consistent. Bullies attack whom they think they can bully. So women are attacked twice as much as men, and children and elders are often disproportionately targeted. And finally, it's clear that race plays a role. Even though people blame China for the racism, over half of our respondents are non-Chinese. They're mostly East Asians who look Chinese, Vietnamese, Filipino, Japanese, Koreans. In fact, in LA, a Latino person was attacked and told to go back to China. And in Vancouver, an Indigenous person was attacked and told to go back to China. So these trends have been consistent. They haven't tailed off from 2020, but they continue in 2021. I'll skip and talk about some other adverse impacts of the racism, just so that you could understand the impact. It's been violent, it's been deadly, but it's had other adverse impacts as well. Asian Americans are among the most distressed racial groups in the US. And because of that, we're concerned about the pandemic, we're concerned about the quarantine, but we're also concerned about anti-Asian violence. And those who experience anti-Asian hate have higher rates of stress, depression, anxiety, and somatic symptoms. So here's a real chilling fact. When asked, what's your greatest stressor during the pandemic? Asian Americans who experienced racism firsthand, Asian Americans overwhelmingly said that racism was their greatest stressor. So more than a deadly, contagious pandemic that's killed over 700,000 people in the United States, more than a contagious disease, Asian Americans are more concerned about other Americans and their hate. That's how widespread the racism is. That's how chilling it is. That's how traumatizing it is. That's how fearful we are about our elders. We can wear masks against COVID-19. We can get vaccinations, but we can't get vaccinated from the racism. We can't be masked from random strangers pushing our elders. And that's why we have such a high state of trauma and anxiety. Because of racism, people are avoiding Asian businesses, Chinese restaurants, Vietnamese nail salons, Korean dry cleaners. And as a result, those businesses actually shut down earlier, even before government shutdowns, and they had to lay off large portions of the Asian American working class. We have the second highest rate of unemployment of any racial group behind Blacks. And actually, those who have high school degrees or less in California, those in the working class and in the service sector, Asians in that high school level, that educational level, have real high rates of unemployment. 83% filed for unemployment. Those with comparable educations in California, only 37% filed for unemployment. So you could see how the racism against Asians has really impacted our employment status. And finally, I'll just wrap up. I said history will repeat itself. Asians have been scapegoated with the term Chinese virus. We have met with interpersonal violence with 9,000 cases that reported to us. The Pew Research Center said 45% of Asian Americans experience direct racism. That's over 8 million cases of hate. So history has repeated itself with violence, and history repeats itself with exclusionary policies. So it's been like the second Chinese Exclusion Act. The US last year with the Trump administration banned Chinese scientists and researchers. The administration then suspended migration visas so families couldn't reunite. He extended the Muslim ban that Professor Umemoto talked about. He cut refugee resettlement, and he also cut H-1B visas. All these policies disproportionately impacted Asians and perceived us as the yellow peril, perpetual foreigners to be excluded as national security threats or public health threats. So it's been a period where several different types of policies, including the China Initiative, which racially profiles Chinese researchers, and a ban on WeChat. There's been several policies that are clearly, in my eyes, racist. To wrap up, we have been fighting. History's repeated itself in that we see racism coming with the disease, but in all the historic incidents that Professor Umemoto cited, Asians have always fought back. We fought back against the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, and we're fighting back now. And because Asian Americans have been standing up, because they've been mobilizing together as a racial group, because we've been building support with allies, because we actually have Asian American elected officials, we've been able to make some change. We've been able to pass hate crime legislation. We've been able to get the president to sign 2 executive orders against racism. And in the state of California, we got the legislator to fund $156 billion to Asian American organizations and Pacific Islander organizations. This bill acknowledges the racism we're facing and the historic institutional inequities we face in health, mental health, public safety, and education. So we are making change, we are standing up. And so I look forward to the discussion afterwards. And again, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Professor Jeung, for sharing the data with specifics and also sharing some of the outcomes, economic outcomes, and also policy, and as well as potential solutions. Thank you. Our third speaker is Mr. Robin Toma. He is Executive Director of Los Angeles County Commission on Human Relations and President of International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies. Mr. Toma has been on the front lines confronting anti-Asian hate in LA County with one of the highest number of incidents in the United States. He led in the creation of the first government system to track and respond to all acts of hate-motivated hostility, not only hate crime. And the website is www.lavsahh.org. LAVERSUSHATE, that means LA versus hate.org. And he has over 25 years of leadership experience responding to issues of race relations, human and civil rights, and he will share strategies to address racial violence and attacks, drawing from examples in Los Angeles and elsewhere. Welcome, Mr. Toma.
Thank you, Professor Cindy Fan, and thank you, APRU, for having me here as part of this. And I'm really honored to be part of this wonderful panel. I've had an opportunity to work with many of the individuals and just think the world of them. So it's a great opportunity to be with them and with all of you. It's very exciting to think that you all are coming to us from all around the Pacific Rim, including Asia and the Americas. I think 25 universities is what I heard, and over 270 people, could be higher by now. So I'm really excited to be able to speak to you about what's happening here in Los Angeles County and some other parts of the country. Let me share my screen and give you a bit of background about myself. I just want to mention that the International Association of Official Human Rights Agency is a nonprofit. It's a network that connects all of the governmental human rights, human relations, civil rights agencies from around the country. And then I also have a government hat with LA County government. I think I'm the only government person here in that sense. But I would preface this by saying it's so important that you understand that I start off with the premise that government has a fundamental responsibility to uphold and protect and advance the human rights of all of its community members. That's not an addendum. It's not something that one part of what it does. It's really the primary responsibility it has above all others. And so it's hard to imagine that, because I know the history of government isn't always reflective of that mission. And I think it's because, of course, that government has often reflected the most powerful sectors in society, including racial minorities and also other politically powerful groups. So that has not been the historic view of government, and that poses challenges. But our position as an association, as a nonprofit network, and as a county government agency is that human rights and civil rights are, in fact, a fundamental responsibility of government. So I want to take you through to some of the impacts here in Los Angeles County, which has 1.5 million Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, one of the largest populations in the country. We are the largest county population-wise. And what we have been seeing, we've been collecting hate crime data now for over 40 years now, since 1980, one of the oldest in doing that. And I think that that's part of the recognition that government has a responsibility to address hate crimes. And so what we've seen in 2020, the most recent complete year in which we have accumulated the data and compiled and analyzed it, is that hate crimes rose 76% in LA County, and that's compared to 73% in the United States. So you can see that that is a similar increase, which is very sad, because you have heard already the litany of lament, as Dr. Jeung referred to it, of the many people who have suffered during this time. And I think that really is important to underline. This is understated, because even US government studies show that twice as many hate crimes are committed than are actually reported to the federal government, to the FBI. So there's tremendous underreporting of the hate violence and hostility and prejudice that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders experience in our country. And I know that even though I think that we do much better here in LA County, because we've been doing this much longer and educating the community and law enforcement, it's still grossly understated and underreported. This picture is of Hong Lee, who is one of the victims of a hate incident that was really, I think, very emblematic of the problem, of one of the problems that we see. She was simply waiting in line to get food at a restaurant. And when a man asked her if she would have lunch with him, and she said no, he began to become very hostile, just almost furious, throwing anti-female and anti-Asian epithets against her. And this rant continued for quite some time, while she, was backing off and keeping her distance from this angry man who was just going on and on. The employees of that restaurant stood by, and other customers just stood by watching, stunned by what they were seeing, but not taking any action. When the police finally came, after she had phoned them, the police officer came, listened to her story, and said, "I'm so sorry, there's really nothing I can do about it. It happens all the time. I'll walk you to your car." So that, in a nutshell, really reflects the experience of so many who don't even come to the point of calling the police, and they don't call the police because of stories like this, where they receive no help. And that is the reason why we really don't know the true picture. Although the work of Stop AAPI Hate and other organizations have really shown the light on many of the hate crimes, we know that's still very understated. It also reflects the challenge of working with law enforcement, and we'll come to that later. I also included another case here from 2020 about a Chinese man who was waiting at a bus stop when across the street, a white female started yelling, "Go back where you came from, you effing Chinese." She then crossed the street and punched him 3 times in the face. He yelled that he was going to call the police, and she fled. Sadly, this is the kind of incredibly outrageous incident that has happened to so many in our county and across the country. And I wanted to say that Hong Lee is an ambassador because, unlike many, and Cesar Chano here you see pictured, is also one who decided not to simply hide or feel like they just had to stay away because the fear was palpable in terms of what they experienced. They actually were supported by community to come out and speak out against others. And Hong Lee really took a chance all on her own by posting on social media. And when she did that, she found there were many others who experienced the same hostility by the same man. So for that, it really reflects the incredible efforts and courage by many victims who have stood up against hate. And this also goes to Dr. Jung's comment about the resistance, because that has been taken up by so many organizations, so many activists. Let me go back to the key findings. We saw sharp rises in anti-Asian hate crime in 2019, before the pandemic. And I think this is important to underline because clearly it means that the pandemic is obviously an exacerbating factor, but it is not the only factor, which means that after the pandemic, I hope there will be an after, when that occurs, we're still going to be facing anti-Asian hostility and hate and violence. And I think that is so important to keep in mind because I think it can be easy to expect that when the pandemic goes away, so will the anti-Asian violence. But the data that we have tells us that it really preceded it and might be very well connected to the targeting of China as an economic competitor, as a threat. We know that caused violence in the 80s with the anti-Japanese sentiment around the auto industry and the threat to US jobs. That same kind of attitude seems to be playing a role perhaps in the anti-Asian hate crime that we saw prior to the pandemic. We also saw that the anti-Asian hate crimes became more violent than in prior years. Unfortunately, that's confirming what we have seen in terms of the anecdotal reports of individual incidents. And it confirmed that most of the victims were older in age than before. And the median age of those victims increased from 30 to 41. Some more key findings of our anti-Asian hate report is that, contrary to a lot of common opinions, most of the suspects in cases where we knew the suspect's race were white, followed by Latinx and African-American. Some have posited because of what's been seen in social media, what's been amplified by traditional news media, is that African-Americans played an outsized role. clearly, that's not what we're seeing in terms of the actual numbers. And I think it's a really important point to address the misperceptions that are out there. Women went from being 29% of victims to 41% of anti-Asian hate crime victims in 2020. And physical assaults were 54% of all anti-Asian hate crimes. And that raised the level of violence that I mentioned earlier to a higher level than it's been in the past. So I wanted to talk about some of the lessons learned that have led to our strategies. And this really actually goes back to, as was mentioned, the many years that we have been tracking hate crime and organizing against hate crime in LA County. One of the things that we saw is that because there isn't a government and community response to everyday acts of hate, and when I say hate acts, I'm talking not only about hate crime, but all the incidents of hostility and anger and prejudice and bigotry that have been talked about. There has been no government mechanism. And what that's meant, or one of the causes of that, of course, is we are situated in a time where we're just, at this moment in time, following a long history of systemic racism and commonly embraced racism against not just Asians, but a whole range of racial, sexual, and gender minorities in this country, and I dare say around the world. So one of the things that we realized that we had to do is to create a system of response that is not dependent on police, because one of the things that happens is that there is a fear of reporting to police, and it needs to be something that can lead to targeted systemic institutional changes. So that's one element of the strategies that came out of our lessons learned. The second thing is that, as I mentioned, most acts of hate are not known or captured. I am certain that every one of us on this call in the United States and probably abroad can point to incidents where they have been targeted with hostility because of their race or their perceived race or ethnicity. And yet I can guarantee that it would be a rare case that those were actually reported. That has changed in this period, but it really was very uncommon to know about those. And so we believe that we need to create a non-police reporting system. And so we utilize one that already exists here in LA County, which is 211. Simple, short, easy to remember, and allows people to report to a community-based organization, a nonprofit that connects people to help. And we also recognize that it helps to capture all those people who don't want to contact the police or government. The third issue is the sense of isolation and vulnerability that the Asian community felt and all victims of hate often feel. And I think that is reflected or caused by the fact that you don't see the majority of people who are against hate violence. It's not visible to people. They're not seeing people necessarily stand up quickly or strongly to hate when they are experiencing or seeing it right before them. And so we recognize that we needed to really expand the ways in which people can show that unity against hate through social media, through marketing, through other actions. And we needed to train people in upstander training, because that's such an important way that people can not only show that that they're prepared to do something about hate when they see it, but it also gives people a sense of confidence that they don't have to be afraid. They can step out. They have some sense of what to do should it happen to them. And the seniors being trained to do that, it was really powerful to see them embrace that sense of confidence, even though there, of course, are many parts of the training that tell them, really you have to take someone along with you. And be careful about where you go. But that has a powerful impact on our communities to know that they can step out and they have a sense of what they can do, and they're going to have people who are going to know what to do around them. The fourth thing is that we recognize there's been insufficient resources for community and government in building an infrastructure against hate. And the cause and factor of that is that there has just been that lack of political will, and that the data hasn't been there. So one of the values of collecting all the hate crime and hate incident data is that we can really show the breadth of of prejudice and hostility that is targeting a given community. And so that has been critical in being able to demonstrate the need for greater investments, public investment and private support to build that system of reporting and action against hate. So LA versus hate is what we build, and this is actually something that we were building prior to the pandemic. It was probably September before the announcement of the global pandemic that we were in 2019 that we started training our partner 211 on how to handle reports of hate that came to them. But it's been since then something we have expanded in this way. We have, on the left, you can see we have wanted to unite communities against hate through a public education campaign and engagement that has tried to utilize art and social media to really spread the word about reporting hate to 211 and showing that people are united against hate. The second one is to build that system, and it's a 24-hour system, 7 days a week, multilingual, confidential. You can also report via the internet. And we have case managers who follow up with people to make sure they are getting the help they need. And I think that's so important because unless people feel like there's a response, reporting often dies out once the initial attention is passes. We want people to know that it's worth it for them to call. They'll get help, free help. And then the third part, the third column you'll see is building local community capacity to not just effectively respond to prevent hate as well. And so that's where, going back to the Hong Lee's case, working with the State Department of Fair Employment and Housing, we were able to bring about an agreement with the business, with the restaurant she was at, to train their employees on how to respond to hate happening in their restaurant and to post signs to deter those from going to that place to begin with. So that they have, there's a tone set with signage that says we don't tolerate hate in this establishment. We think that's the kind of practice that needs to happen in many more businesses, and with that, we can deter hate from happening in the first place. People often wonder, so besides prosecution of a hate crime perpetrator, what can you do? There's actually quite a bit that can be done. I've talked about, and you heard earlier about the impact on mental health to so many victims of hostility and hatred in the API communities. But there's also legal remedies, not just victim compensation, but there are civil rights and anti-discrimination laws that can be used. And that's what we did with Hong Lee's case. There's training, as I mentioned, both with seniors and with bystanders. So victims and bystanders can get free training online. And we also work with other government agencies like Children and Family Services when we have a case where parents are condoning minors in hate crime. And unfortunately, we have seen that in some of our parts of LA County to the degree that it's horrifying. Some of the change that we're seeking, as I mentioned, changing business practices, but also working with schools and community centers to help them transform their campus climates and their neighborhood attitudes. And we work with city governments throughout LA County. There are 88 governments, cities within LA County that we work with to support them in having an infrastructure against hate and taking proactive action. This is quickly some of the stuff that we have on our LA versus Hate website, including a huge mural that has been a way to really send a message to community. Here's some of the digital content, over 400 unique pieces with over 350 million visits. And you can see it represents all the diversity of cultures and identities, both geographic and ethnic within LA County. And this is just an example of how it's not only the pandemic hate has affected people, but that hate has in turn prevented them from actually getting help during the pandemic for their needs. And it happens to Latinos as well as Asian Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians. And here's just a summary. It actually mirrors quite a bit what Dr. Jeung showed earlier about the kind of types of acts that are happening that are mostly derogatory name calling, but also involve discrimination, bullying, and as well as physical assault and burglaries. But one of the areas that I think is really understated is the amount of online hate. This just gives you a sense of the network we've built with community-based organizations And I won't go through them, but they're just from a variety of organizations, not only the Asian American community, but the LGBT community, the Muslim community, the African American community, the Latino community, the immigrant communities, the Jewish communities, all are represented here in our network that are funded by our agency. And just so you have a sense that we're not the only ones in the United States, although I think we're the only ones so far who have a response system that offers assistance, connects everyone who calls with assistance. What you do have in New York City is a really robust public education campaign with resources, posters that can be downloaded in 15 Asian languages. Minnesota's Hennepin County government has been working with us to build their own reporting system. And that's the place where George Floyd was killed. And they have invested over $1 million in building their system and taking advantage of the existing systems and are tracking the data, which I think is really important and a great first step towards building the kind of infrastructure you need. Just the last thing is just to talk about where we need to go. And I mentioned online hate. We're clear that there is a need to address what individuals are doing when they see hate, but we also need to look at the systemic policies and practices of social media companies. We've also heard about Facebook and Instagram and their role in allowing their algorithms to really to exacerbate polarity and stimulate anger and polarize our communities and really, I think, further hate among the users of social media. And then we also recognize that that's a place where white nationalism and supremacy has moved to. They've reduced in numbers of groups and they've amplified in number of individuals online. The second part is needing to really expand our reach of all the vulnerable populations. We need to have more resources and training and funding of CBOs, and we need to institutionalize all of this into regular budgets. And that's the part that I think is really a challenge, because often at this time there's an increase in funding, but when the crisis passes, when the pandemic ends, I think we're going to need to struggle with the tendency to want to shut down the funding for this work. But it can't be, because we know it's not just tied to the pandemic. So with that, I'm going to end and appreciate all of you listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Toma, for a very informative presentation with a lot of the demographics, gender breakdown, and particularly sharing with us these effective strategies and also all the resources that are available for not only anti-Asian hate incidents, but also a very expansive approach toward all communities that include victims from all communities. Thank you very much. Last but not least, our final speaker today, it's Professor Robert Greenberg, Dean of the Faculty of Arts at the University of Auckland. So we go from Los Angeles, California, to a completely different part of the world. He's a native of New York City, and he has taught at Georgetown University, University of North Carolina, and Yale University before he moved to New Zealand in 2013 to take on the deanship. He has published on the link between language, nationalism, and ethnic conflict in the Balkans. And in his presentation, he will discuss anti-Asian hate in the context of the Christchurch mosque massacres of 2019, including the causes and the aftermath of the attack on the university community. Welcome, Professor Greenberg.
Thank you very much, Professor Fan. It's a pleasure to be here today from Auckland, and greetings to everyone. We're going to have screen sharing via APRU, so if that can start, that would be lovely. And yeah, I'm here to talk to you about anti-Asian, anti-Muslim hate that was manifested here, obviously, in the Christchurch attacks. Before that, though, I want to just start with a very brief mihi, a greeting in Māori, which alongside English is an official language of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I think it's something that I hope that it'd be very short, but there should be on the screen the translation. Tihe moriora, e ngā rangatira, e ngā kai kawe turanga, tēnā tātou katoa. So thank you for that. In New Zealand, we have a long history of negotiating the relationship between white Europeans, in particular the settlers, and our indigenous Maori community, the Polynesian peoples who are indigenous to this land. My acknowledgement of Maori people through the greeting in Maori is something that we are increasingly engaging in New Zealand over the last, I'd say, even over the time that I have been in this country since 2013. We are all keen to learn our other official language in alongside English, Maori. We're all keen to learn that here, and it is something that is really in part of our, I'd say, the revival of Maori culture and language going on at the moment, and a revitalization. And I think this is linked to the subject matter today as well, as you will soon see. The partnership between the English settlers, or the Crown in particular, and Maori began in 1840, in particular with the Treaty of Waitangi, which outlined a partnership between the Crown, the British Crown, and our indigenous population. And while it sounds like that would have been the end of the story, it was only the beginning of the story, because obviously our history, which I will not go through in the limited amount of time that I have, was that the relationships were not harmonious. There was quite a bit of conflict, fighting, land confiscations, many of the things that do happen in colonial societies, and that definitely did happen here. However, in more recent times, post-World War II, I would say there's been a sort of revival of Maori culture over time, and a restoration of the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, where the Crown and the government here now, which represents the Crown in that regard, is settling with many of the tribes within New Zealand. It is a pluralistic society that also has become welcoming to many, many immigrants, especially from nearby Pacific Islands and other Polynesian people. So we have Auckland is the largest Polynesian city in the world with the largest Polynesian population, from Tonga, from Samoa, from other islands. And as well, we have from other more nearby countries in the northwest of us, from Southeast Asia, South Asia, large communities of Asian peoples as well that have immigrated to this country. The thing that I think really took us all by surprise was how, in such a peaceful country where the relationships seem to be quite in good, quite secure, quite okay, we would have the horrific mosque attack of 2019, March 15th, 2019. I think it was partly a response from one individual who was a white supremacist, yes. There was a lot of chatter on social media post the election of Donald Trump, particularly in the United States, with the Charlottesville incidents in 2017. A lot of that kind of chatter that seems to have influenced the Christchurch Terrorists. Those of you who will recall, it was the worst massacre in New Zealand's history. 51 people were slaughtered in 2 mosques in the city of Christchurch in the South Island. At least 21 of these were born in South Asia, so Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and many others were first or second generation New Zealanders who were of that same origin. There were also victims from Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and I think that the youngest victim was a 3-year-old, obviously born in New Zealand. So remembering what some of the others have said, violence, hatred, bigotry, white supremacy, these were the things that seem to have motivated our Christchurch terrorists. And I think what we could see, though, in this country was an effort on the part of a new, relatively new government. So Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's government took power in 2017 with an agenda of being quite a bit more tolerant towards non-European New Zealanders. So I'm thinking of trying to find ways of advancing Maori and Pacific communities within New Zealand, and also upholding the pluralism of the society. And I think we all remember the pictures of Jacinda Ardern and her response to the horrific events of March 15th, 2019. She embraced Muslim communities. She wore a hijab herself. She personally went to comfort families. Our media had the sounds of the Muslim call to prayer on the hour for the several days after the attack. The country united in grief and horror. And I think leadership does make a huge difference in that sense of trying to nip this kind of hatred and violence in the bud. We also know that as a result of what happened, quite strict gun control laws were passed in record time in this country. I'm not saying that any of this was perfect, but I do think that it certainly has helped minimize any further repercussions in terms of very obvious anti-Asian or anti-Muslim hate that we have seen since 2019. Perhaps for me, though, as a university leader and dean of a faculty of arts, which includes social sciences and humanities, what did surprise me, however, was that the attack itself did have a bit of a tentacle into our upsetting our community. It emboldened certain elements within our community, certain white supremacist elements, to speak up and to maybe attack verbally. I have to say most of these things were verbal. Others in our community. There was anti-Asian, anti-Muslim, anti-Maori, anti-Pacific graffiti that appeared on our campus. There was an organization that seemed to be an outside organization called the European Students Association that was really espousing white supremacist ideas. And there were outbursts when you're a dean, you hear about these in certain classes. We had one tutorial where the tutor was South Asian and Muslim, and one of the students openly, in front of other students, openly condemned our Treaty of Waitangi, which is the partnership with our Maori, and also said disparaging things that Muslims in New Zealand should go home, and those kinds of things occurred. That sounds in itself as an isolated instance, but in fact, there were many similar incidents occurring simultaneously, I'd say within a week or two of the mosque attacks. The way that we dealt with that was to try, like our prime minister perhaps, to try do our best to nip it in the bud and establish very strong ground rules in terms of our values as a community. We established a group with called Te Ropu Whakamana Tangata, an arts incident response team, to try and mitigate the damage that was done by the perpetrators of white supremacist rhetoric and how they had been hurtful to other members of the community. And one of the key principles that we used was an indigenous value of working to uphold the mana, which is the standing, and the tapu, which is the inherent value of all members of our community, not to let those the standing and inherent value of anybody to be diminished, and find ways of supporting and upholding those values. So we started on a very strong push towards a values-based approach to how to work with our community. The university community that when witnessing instances of white supremacist rhetoric and hateful comments, especially on social media, the reason that I say that there was a bit of a crisis was it created a sense that the environment was not safe. Many students, staff, faculty, people on campus were feeling unsafe. They were worried about copycat attacks. There were threats by white supremacists on various platforms, Reddit and so on, that were emulating some of the rhetoric that was in the manifesto of the Christchurch Terrorists. And so even though no violence did in fact occur, the sense of being unsafe was rampant during those weeks that followed. And so the university set up a crisis management team, both to work on the communication piece with our staff and students, faculty, staff, and students, how to make everybody feel as safe as possible, how to take down all the graffiti the minute that it was spotted, have a crisis management system to do that, where we were all plugged into a manager of the crisis, and then respond immediately to any sense of feeling unsafe. We had a situation where one of the white supremacists frequented one of our graduate labs, and a lot of the other MA and doctoral students did not want to frequent that lab if that person was present. So it was both, it was a lot of that kind of sense of creating as much as possible a safe environment. So, you know, yes, you can post guards there and all the rest, but what we ended up trying to do is making sure that people would also follow the processes for filing any sorts of complaints about their feeling unsafe, because the one way that we could actually deal with people who made people unsafe, and this particular individual had himself greeted a Jewish student of ours with a Hail Hitler salute, which was, of course, one of those things to provoke and intimidate. So when complaints could be filed, we could then deal with this in university processes, which could involve banning somebody from coming to campus until the dispute or the complaint could be resolved, and finding other means to make our members of our community safe. What I learned from all of this is how important to respond immediately, empathetically, and as quickly as possible to these kinds of things, because I think if you do not, and these things do become go out of hand, things do deteriorate very, very quickly. So I think the biggest lesson that I would have learned from the anti-Asian hate and how to respond to the anti-Asian and anti-Muslim hate that we experienced also on our campus is to take a lesson perhaps from what happened nationally in New Zealand, respond forcefully, empathetically, but without tolerating the unsafe environment from taking hold on our community. Thank you very much for your attention today. I'm going to stop there and look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Professor Greenberg, for sharing this a different case, but also sounds like that this case really has a lot in common with the hate that is experienced in the US and other places. And thank you so much also for sharing the strategies and approaches that you've used that have proven effective. Now may I ask all the panelists to switch on their videos so that we can perhaps respond to some of the questions that have come in from the audience. And I'm seeing perhaps two sets of questions, at least two sets of questions. So one set of question, it's more specific to the US context, and the other set of questions seem to be much broader. So let me start with the questions that are more specific to the US context. One question has to do with the underreporting of hate crime and incidents, which I think both Russell and Robin had talked about. The question is, does the underreporting rate higher? Is the underreporting higher than other kind of crime? And what is the main reason of underreporting of hate crime at all? So I wonder if Russell and Robin could address that question.
I can start. So first of all, we have to distinguish between a hate incident and a hate crime. A crime is something you can get arrested for. A hate incident could be more broad. It could be verbal harassment. It could be online cyberbullying. It could be vandalism. And so hate crimes, again, are crimes. And then if it's a hate crime, racial bias and motivation is discerned, and it's really difficult to prosecute. So for Asians to report to us, we were really surprised, because, and it's actually fortuitous that we're a community-based coalition, because we're finding that people were much more likely to report to us as a community entity rather than as a government agency. It's actually clear, they actually say that in our reporting centers, like, I'm reporting to you. And then we ask, did you report to the police? And they would say no. And so what we're finding is that Asian Americans are reporting to us, not necessarily the crimes, but the hate incidents, because they figure, why report an incident where police and government can't do anything, right? They don't expect the government to be able to respond if someone just spits on them, or they don't think that, someone just yelled at me, and it was a passing moment, they're not going to be able to catch the perpetrator. So the first reason why people tend to not report is because they don't think anything could be done about it, right? It's government can't respond quickly enough. The second reason is that we actually surveyed our respondents, and we're thinking that Asians have a different sense of justice and what they expect from government. They didn't necessarily want individual redress, in that they wanted the perpetrator to be punished and to go to prison. They didn't want actually more mass incarceration, but they wanted to develop a collective voice so that government would develop policies to make it stop. So rather than seeking an individual response of police incarcerating an individual, they wanted a collective response where government is held accountable to make things safe for everybody. It's a real different perspective in at least our respondents. And then there's other reasons why people don't report to government beyond it being not useful or reasonable. There's language barriers. You could have concerns about your status, maybe as undocumented. A lot of people don't have access to technology. And it's just really hard to report to government authorities. We tried to do it on California's, and it's a really complex system. Robin's organization, the 211, is much better as the model for the nation of how you can access it. They have translated, they have, it's a system that's much more accessible for all communities. And so again, I keep on applauding LA versus Hate and their Human Rights Commission's 211 program.
Thank you, Russell. Robin, what do you think?
So I would just add to that. Thank you, Russell, for that comment. The thing to remember about hate crimes is that it actually didn't exist when you look back several decades. At times, it probably, I know LA and California, it was in the 80s that the laws were passed to actually make it a particular crime that would add penalties. So first of all, I think the fact is that there was a lot of training that had to happen with law enforcement to even be understanding and supportive of the idea of taking a report on a hate crime. And I was part of those trainings in the 90s. And I got a lot of skepticism from law enforcement who said, why are we doing a separate thing for a hate murder when we have a murder law? Why are we doing a separate thing for an assault when we have a hate motivated assault when we have already an assault law? Why do we need to add this additional element? And that was something that I think is telling about the reason why we have a lot of jurisdictions in the United States, policing jurisdictions that do not go through regular training and are very reluctant to report. In fact, I think it's more than half of all the jurisdictions that report to the FBI report 0 hate crimes. So I think, and I would tell you that if you were to look at the Justice Department's tracking in their annual survey where they call thousands of people and ask them about whether they've experienced crime, including hate crime, that they will have reported hate crime in some of those jurisdictions, but did not go from that law enforcement agency to the FBI. Some don't even have laws. A few states don't even have hate crime laws. So that's another reason why you won't find the numbers that are appearing in the FBI report nationally to be reflective of the actual number of reports, in addition to everything else that Dr. Jeung said.
Thank you, Russell Robin. So what I'm hearing, therefore, is that probably because of the lack of data or lack of reporting for a long time, then our knowledge about hate crime actually is a fairly recent knowledge as a result of more mechanisms for reporting and more awareness. Let me now switch to a question from a student, and I think that this student's question really, I think, resonates with what Robert has shared with us in terms of what the University of Auckland has been doing. But I actually want to ask Chancellor Block this question. So this student asked, I really appreciate the time and effort put into today's lesson. As a college student, what steps can I take to help my community and myself create a safer environment for all?
That's really an excellent question. What is an individual student, what you can do? And I think part of what you can do, of course, is be well informed, as I think this seminar helps, about what some of the challenges are and what some of the forces that are contributing to this behavior. And then, of course, as a for example, in the U.S., as a citizen, as a voter, you can first mobilize support for candidates that clearly understand the importance of diversity. So, of course, and organize other students who sometimes don't vote in the United States, unfortunately, and should vote, again, to support candidates who really appreciate diversity and have no tolerance for the types of behaviors that we're seeing here. So I'd say, as a student, in addition to becoming well educated about these issues, I think you actually have a lot of influence by actually at the ballot box, literally, and make sure that your views are clearly stated. Often our students don't vote when they should be voting on issues that are important to them personally. And this is a great example where it's important to mobilize the community, not only the Asian American community, but also all students who feel strongly about these issues. So that's one thing I would say, Professor Fan, would be helpful.
Thank you so much, Jean. Now let me switch to a couple of questions that really take us, more broadly to kind of a global, providing kind of a global perspective. So let me try to maybe combine a couple of questions. Racial motivated incidents and rhetorical politics in many developed countries are also opening cracks in many developing countries, which have undergone reconciliation and acceptance. So any suggestion on local wisdoms for coexistence? So this is about really the idea of coexistence with a local context. Now, another attendee asked a question that's also about, more broadly, a global view. Why is xenophobia becoming so common all over the world? I think not only in the United States, but also in other countries, including Asian countries like China, especially during the pandemic, when it seems to become a natural choice for governments to seek for foreigner scapegoats to blame when encountering economic or political difficulties. Is there anything we can do to stop this? So I'm wondering if Robert and Karen can comment on why is xenophobia happening all over the world, and what can we do to stop this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it resonated with me what Chancellor Block said about if we have a democracy and we can vote for the non-divisive people who come to non-xenophobic type of parties or candidates, I think that can help a lot. What we have seen over recent, and I'm not a political scientist, but looking even at the Balkans, I mean, ethno-nationalism was where people voted. They thought they voted for their tribe, and it resulted in catastrophe. And I think what we really have to try to work towards is voting for those who believe in pluralism. Pluralism should not be dead. Pluralism should be alive and well. And I think pluralistic societies have so much to offer, so much more richness, and that that is one way of countering this kind of hatred, because there should be a place for everybody. And the more diverse we are, the stronger we actually are. And I think so that's one thing. On the local wisdom, what we learned a lot was we're learning from our indigenous people. They have very strong sense of values, a very strong sense of dignity and respect, and respecting human life. And I think that is another area that we should move from to our indigenous. It's sometimes the answer is right here and not some kind of global phenomenon or global answer, but a local answer.
And I would just add, thank you. Yes, I would just add to that. I mean, I think I can't speak for any particular countries, but I could speak on kind of from some of the global and theoretical work on ethnic and racial conflict. I mean, there are different theories that I think all kind of contribute to explaining what's happening. I think one of the theories of why there's ethno-racial conflict is competition over resources. And that has to do with colonialism and kind of the historic ties that people have to access to resources and power over the use of resources and jobs and services and those kinds of things. So when there's competition that falls along racial ethnic lines, then we see that kind of rise. Another explanation is political favoritism. When people in power are seen to favor one group over the other, that causes resentment between different groups, and particularly resentment among those who are disfavored against those who feel privileged. And then on the other hand, there's a sense of superiority among those who are in the privileged position, who may look down upon or see others as less than they are just based on their status. And a third major explanation is just the way in which in our minds, in our imaginations, people are constructed as evil or greedy or disease-ridden or somehow a threat to others. And I think that's where the media, that's where educational systems, and that's where popular culture comes in, right, to shape impressions that people have and images that people have of one another, so that when people associate certain ethnic groups with certain types of characteristics, you get, really, you can get very negative interactions and intergroup relations. So I think you could apply that anywhere and see what kinds of, and then the fourth one, which is I think a big factor, is just political opportunism. People are able to whip up fear against one group amongst another group, and that often leads to groups, fighting against each other or victimizing one another. And I think throughout history, when we've seen these periods of rising racist attacks, they've almost always accompanied kind of political campaigns, kind of pandering to the fear of others, of certain groups against others. So I think we'll have to deal with all of those, right, in the long run to address the problem.
Thank you, Karen, for such a complete answer to this question. And I know that we're winding down to the last minute, but I can't resist but to ask you one more question from the audience. Karen, are you well, I think you also mentioned education. So are you lobbying, therefore, for the teaching of Asian and Asian American history in American schools? And are things better in states like California, Hawaii? We talked about California, but of course, Hawaii very well too. So Karen, can you quickly answer this question? Yes, and yes. I mean, education is really, really the key in the long run. And one of the things that we're doing at our Asian American Studies Center is, and I'll take kind of the shameless self-promotion here of our center.
one of the things that we're doing, and this was even before this all happened, we're developing a digital Asian American Studies textbook so that anyone could learn Asian American Studies, history, contemporary issues, as long as they have a computer or mobile device. We want to democratize Asian American Studies so that people can really learn about our vast histories and our differences and evolution here and within the diasporas, so that people can develop what's called a historical empathy, right? If you don't know a group, it's easy to get painted in a certain negative way and believe kind of so many of the lies and distorted truths, that are circulating. So I think the more people understand ethnic studies, the history of all of our diverse groups in this country, the more historical empathy people will feel, and then the more compassion and people will have, and the less prone they'll be to getting whipped up by, opportunist politicians or whatever, and have us turn against one another. So I'm a definitely strong proponent of ethnic studies, and I know that this is going to be an uphill battle just because of the attacks on critical race theory that we're seeing right now. So, but thank you. I hope to have more of these kinds of conversations about what's ahead to come. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. And then I wanted to invite all our participants to thank all our panelists. So let's give them a big applause, even though we can't hear you. And I wanted to remind all the attendees that we will be sending the rest of the questions that didn't get a chance to be asked. We'll be sending all the questions to the panelists. And also the recording and slides will be shared via email and on the website, apru.org. And please be reminded that part 2 of the series will be on November 17th at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time and November 18th at 9 a.m. Hong Kong time. And so I'd like to thank all the panelists again, thank all the attendees from across the Pacific Rim and beyond. And we hope to see you in part 2 of the series. Goodbye and thank you.